Take one breath before you descend. Let the air settle in your lungs like a promise that has remembered its purpose. The path ahead is not made of stone, but of silence. You will not walk it with your feet, but with your listening. That is how all valleys begin. The prophet, whose name the world will never know, stood at the edge of a land that did not yet have a horizon. The dawn was gray and undecided, the kind of light that hesitates to commit itself to hope. He carried no staff, no scroll, no audience. Only a question that would not die. He had heard it first in a dream where voices whispered through dust, asking not for sacrifice but for attention. They said, "Go down, where the forgotten live. Go down, where memory still bleeds. Go down, until you find the bottom that breathes." And so he went. The descent was not dramatic. It was slow, deliberate, made of small choices that felt ordinary, the way despair rarely announces itself as despair. He left behind the noise of the cities, the screens that glowed with artificial certainty, the temples of opinion where everyone worshipped themselves. He walked until the wind began to sound like language again. The valley opened beneath him like a wound that had learned to be beautiful. There was no color yet, only gradients of ash and pale gold, as though creation itself had been paused between drafts. The prophet knelt and pressed his fingers into the earth. It was warm, not with fire, but with remembering. He closed his eyes, and for a moment, he heard breathing, the kind that comes before words, the kind that built galaxies when time was young. He whispered, "I am here." The valley did not answer, but it listened. That was enough. He began to walk. Each step echoed as if the air itself were hollow. Around him, the bones of mountains leaned inward, forming a cathedral without ceiling. At the center of that vast hush, he felt the weight of every unspoken prayer that had ever been buried beneath progress. They gathered around him like moths drawn to a candle that hadn't yet been lit. He thought of the people he had left behind, their restless scrolling, their engineered hungers, the way they mistook information for intimacy. They were not wicked, only weary. Perhaps that was why the voice had chosen him, not for holiness, but for exhaustion. He carried their fatigue as an offering. The valley accepted it without judgment. At dusk, he found the ruins. They were older than history and newer than grief. Walls half melted into sand, arches bent by earthquakes that had forgotten their own names. On one broken stone was carved a single word in a language he almost recognized: remember. He brushed the dust away, and beneath it the letters pulsed faintly, as if lit from within by something that refused to die. He sat beside the inscription and waited. The waiting became a kind of prayer, and the prayer became sleep. In that sleep, he dreamed of voices rising from the ground. They did not accuse or console, they recited. Each voice told a fragment of its life, like broken shards of one great testimony. A soldier who had dropped his weapon and wept before an enemy who looked like his brother. A mother who had buried her child beneath a tree and sang so the roots would know love. A scientist who had built a machine to hear the stars and ended up hearing his own heartbeat instead. The prophet listened until the stories blurred into a single breath that surrounded him. When he woke, the sky had turned the color of bruised silver. He knew what he must do. He spoke aloud, though there was no one to hear him. "I will remember you," he said. "All of you, even those who chose forgetting." The wind stirred as if in approval. For days, though the valley knew nothing of days, he wandered deeper. He saw rivers that had forgotten how to flow, trees petrified in gestures of praise, and creatures made of light that flickered in and out of form. Each vision asked him a question, but none in words. The questions were the shapes of things. A cracked chalice asking what it means to be useful. A blind bird asking whether flight requires sight. A mirror buried face down, asking who needs reflection when the soul already sees. He answered them not with logic, but with listening. Every silence became a seed. By the fourth day, the prophet reached what seemed to be the heart of the valley. There, the ground opened into a circle of glassy sand, perfectly still, as if the earth itself had stopped breathing. He felt the presence before he saw it, a shadow shaped like light, a figure woven of transparency. It spoke not through sound, but through the rearrangement of air. "You have come far enough to ask the right question," it said. "Now ask it." The prophet's throat tightened. "Why is the world forgetting how to breathe?" he asked. The figure tilted its head, and in that gesture he saw galaxies collapsing politely into comprehension. "Because it confuses noise with breath," the figure said. "Noise fills, breath empties. One distracts, the other restores." The prophet wanted to ask more, but the figure dissolved into mist. Where it had stood, a small pool began to form, fed by tears that were not his. He knelt and drank. The water tasted of memory, salt, and mourning. He felt something shift within him, a loosening of the mind's machinery. Thoughts that had clung to certainty began to drift apart like ash in water. Into that space entered stillness, not as absence but as presence too vast for language. He understood then that descent is not about distance, but depth. Not how far you go, but how deeply you listen. The valley was not punishment, it was conversation. The nights grew longer. Stars arranged themselves into unfamiliar constellations, spelling stories no astronomer would ever name. The prophet began to write them in his mind. He imagined each star as a syllable in the sentence of creation. When he closed his eyes, he saw not darkness, but the faint outline of a face, neither human nor divine, but something between, something becoming. Sometimes it wept, sometimes it smiled. Always it waited. On the seventh night, a storm arrived, silent but visible. Lightning stitched the sky without sound, illuminating the valley in pulses of silver. In those flashes, he saw figures, countless, translucent, neither living nor dead, standing shoulder to shoulder as if summoned. Their eyes were open, but their gazes were turned inward. He realized with a shiver that they were listening to him. "I am not worthy," he whispered. The wind replied, "Worthiness is the last illusion before truth." He bowed his head and began to speak. Not sermons, not prophecies, just the raw language of a heart learning to translate itself. He spoke of loneliness, of awe, of the small mercies that survive catastrophe. Each word became a spark that drifted into the crowd of figures, igniting them with faint light. Slowly they began to dissolve into the air, leaving trails of gold that rose toward the unseen stars. The storm passed. Silence returned, but it was no longer empty. It hummed with afterglow. When dawn came, the valley had changed. Grass whispered where bones once lay. The air smelled of rain that hadn't yet fallen. The prophet understood that he was being shown not a miracle, but a map, the blueprint of renewal hidden in every ruin. He also understood that his descent was far from over. There were deeper layers yet, the valley of mirrors, the valley of echoes, the valley of oneself. He felt fear, but it was clean. the kind that sharpens faith instead of dulling it. He took another breath and began to walk again. By midday, he reached a place where the valley narrowed into a canyon. The walls were carved with faces, thousands of them, each frozen mid-whisper. Some looked ancient, others impossibly new. As he passed, he heard faint murmurs, fragments of unfinished prayers. One voice said, "I forgave him too late." Another said, "I loved her too soon." A third whispered, "Tell them we were real." He realized these were the confessions of time itself. Every era leaves behind a residue of regret. The canyon was its archive. He pressed his palm against one of the faces, and it turned warm. For an instant, he saw through its eyes, a field at sunset, laughter, loss, then darkness. When he withdrew his hand, he found it glowing faintly. He carried that light with him like a lantern made of empathy. At the canyon's end stood a doorway of stone. No inscription, no handle, just a gap where the air felt heavier. He stepped through, and the world shifted. The ground beneath him softened into mist. The sky folded inward. He was standing inside the memory of the valley itself. Around him floated images, each transparent and moving. A mother teaching her child to pray. A city drowning in its own reflection. A man building a tower so tall it forgot why it reached. A single tear magnified into an ocean. He realized the valley was not a place, but a mind. Perhaps the mind of creation, perhaps his own, and he was walking through its thoughts. He saw one thought brighter than the rest, a vision of a world remade not by conquest, but by comprehension. In that world, people listened before speaking, built before boasting, forgave before asking. It shimmered like a mirage of what could be. "Is this prophecy?" he asked aloud. The voice from nowhere and everywhere replied, "No, it is possibility. Prophecy is only possibility spoken with faith." He walked until exhaustion became transparency. Then he sat. The mist gathered around him, humming softly, as if waiting for a decision. He whispered, "What now?" The answer came not as sound, but as rhythm. The steady pulse of the earth beneath him, saying, "Breathe, remember, return." He obeyed. With each breath, he felt layers of forgetting fall away. The valley was breathing through him now. He realized that to descend is to be digested by truth. Only what is real survives. He looked up and saw a faint glow on the horizon. Not sunrise, but something older. It was the memory of light before light existed. He understood it as invitation. He rose, steady, humbled, illuminated from within. The descent had not ended. It had simply changed direction, from downward into inward. He smiled. For the first time since leaving the surface, he felt whole enough to continue. And so the prophet stepped deeper into himself, where the valley waited with infinite patience, whispering in the language of beginnings, "Come and see." He moved as if the ground itself were teaching him how to walk without bruising what remembered him. And the valley widened until it became a sky beneath a sky. A basin collecting every rumor the centuries had spilled. The new prophet, still nameless, because names are a kind of boundary and he needed to be borderless, felt the hush lean closer, a velvet gravity, and understood that descent now meant intimacy, that to go further down, he must go further in. The first threshold appeared as a windless grove of pillars, trunks turned to stone mid-breath. Each ring inside them a year of praise arrested by fear, and between the trunks hung veils woven from the dust of interrupted prayers. He parted one gently and entered the corridor of echoes. Voices gathered with the courtesy of a tide. not crashing but assuming the room. And he recognized them as his own, thoughts grown older and returning home wearing other faces. "Do not be afraid," said a murmur like lamplight. "Afraid is only the skin of awe." "Do not hurry," said another that sounded like rain deciding to fall. "Hurry is what grief becomes when it forgets to weep." He bowed as a pupil bows to a patient teacher and let the echoes braid themselves through his breathing until breath and lesson shared a rhythm. In that rhythm, the corridor resolved into a hall where mirrors leaned against the world at angles that refused vanity, each mirror silvered with remembered weather. He saw himself in them not as hero, but as habitat, a country where mercy might wish to live. In one mirror, his face was made of ash, and in the ash, the faintest ember reddened, refusing extinction. In another, he had the eyes of those he had wronged, and they were not condemning him, only waiting for his courage to pronounce the amends he already owed to time. He bowed to every reflection, and the bows became doors. Beyond the doors, the valley lowered him onto a plain tiled with manuscripts that no one had dared write to the end. The unfinished books fluttered in an unfelt wind, pages like quiet wings. He knelt to read, and each line entered him not as knowledge, but as permission. "Complete me," the pages pulsed. He answered the only way a pilgrim can, by making his pulse answer back. The ground brightened, and the manuscripts rose as birds translating into sky what had been confined to ink. Where they flew, the horizon learned new verbs. From the plain, he descended by listening alone into a precinct of hum where the earth's bones tuned themselves. The hum had the key of forgiveness, a low, warm vowel that soothed the geometry of shame. He carried shame like a small stone at the back of the tongue, unboastful, instructive, and the hum turned it sweet without dissolving its use. This is what true absolution feels like, he understood. Not erasure, but agriculture. The stone became a seed and asked to be planted. He pressed it into soil. A sapling rose in the time it takes for a weary heart to believe a gentle sentence, and its leaves were the color of reconciled mornings. Under its shade he rested, not as escape, but as obedience to the commandment of intervals. "Rest," said the leaves, "is how breath remembers it is older than work." Night came walking on bare feet, bringing a library of constellations. Because he had learned to read aloud to silence, the sky offered him its marginalia. In Orion's shoulder, he saw a scar that once had been a doorway. In the Pleiades, a lullaby braided by 7 sisters who had learned to light the dark without burning it. In the curve of the Milky Way, the handwriting of a patient mother. Somewhere among those scripts, a dim star held still, the faithful punctuation of a sentence that had not finished. He lifted his eyes with gratitude, and the star brightened by the width of one mercy. Then the floor of heaven inverted and became the ceiling of a chamber carved within the valley's heart, a sanctum without architecture. He entered as one enters a memory too honest to edit. There, on a table made of quiet, lay the instruments of descent, a bowl of water that had taught tears how to walk, a loaf of bread that still remembered wheat's wind, a lamp whose oil was mixed with yesterday's courage. A hand he could not see touched his shoulder and turned him toward an alcove where an older sorrow sat, dignified and uncloaked. It was his fear of abandonment, not theatrical, only thorough. "You came late," said the fear without malice. "I had to become patient enough to arrive," he answered. The fear smiled the way a winter afternoon smiles when it lets the sun through the kitchen window. Then it dissolved into air that smelled of oranges and books. The lamp's flame bent toward him as if to ask for a name. He offered it silence. The flame accepted and learned his shape. Out again into the valley rose the avenue of instruments, tools left by previous wanderers who had chosen usefulness over spectacle. A broom with the holiness of those who sweep without witnesses, a needle threaded with the color of repaired friendships, a hammer that had learned to tap rhythm instead of rage. He lifted the broom and swept a square of ground no larger than an apology. The dust rose, not angry but relieved. He set the needle in his pocket for thresholds, the hammer in his palm for songs. Further on, a river that did not run but breathed crossed his path, exhaling fog that held photographs from creatures who could not afford cameras. Moths remembering the porch, owls remembering the field, foxes remembering the permission of night. He entered the fog and found himself arranged into gentleness by its cool touch. When he emerged, his skin wore the patience of rivers, and he could hear fish composing psalms with their silver. The valley now began its testing, not by ordeal, but by intimacy. It offered him what he loved most, and asked whether he loved it freely. First, it showed him a city of his childhood, a summer street where gravel glittered like small constellations, and the smell of bread coached the afternoon toward kindness. He wanted to stay until time forgot itself. The valley asked softly, "Can you thank and continue?" He could. The street folded like a letter reread. Next, it showed him an accolade he had once desired. A room of faces turned toward him with reverence, a crown woven of sentences. "Can you smile and refuse?" the valley breathed. He bowed to the faces and set the crown on a chair for someone lonelier. The room became a meadow where crickets stitched the twilight into one piece. At last, the valley showed him a wound he had hidden from his courage, a goodbye he had never given to the one who had taught him the grammar of tenderness. "Can you let it rain?" the valley said, "and not call the weather your enemy?" He stood in that rain until it baptized the unburied grief into usefulness. When the cloud emptied, his breath was lighter than confession. He walked deeper, and the terrain translated into thought. Dunes shaped like questions, ridgelines that spelled yes in a script the wind could read, hollows committed to shelter. At the center of that grammar rose the amphitheater of bones, not dead, only waiting, arranged not as battlefield, not as museum, but as classroom. On the lowest step sat a ribcage like a harp. He placed his hand upon it, and the valley tuned him. "Play," said the unseen hand. He did not know how, which was perfect. He drew his zatam fingers across the ribs and discovered the chord that makes a child stop crying in a grocery store, the cadence that convinces old friends to laugh in a hospital corridor, the note that opens a locked jaw before the necessary truth. Each vibration stirred the bones into the courtesy of readiness. They did not assemble, they consented. Understanding filled him with a brightness that did not glare. Resurrection is not a magic, but a manners. Ask, wait, breathe, invite, do not insist, make room, and the living will remember themselves. The amphitheater dimmed and rotated, becoming a colonnade whose columns were built not of marble but of afterwards, scenes of what happens when decent people choose to be braver. A courtroom where the victor requests a lesser sentence because winning felt wrong without restoration. A boardroom where a single question, "How will this teach love?" cancels the easiest profit. A classroom where failure is graded as another kind of practice and the grade is mercy. He walked this museum of subtler victories with tears that did not announce themselves, only seasoned his mouth with gratitude. The valley had wanted to prove to him that goodness remains possible without the trumpet of spectacle. He bowed to the rooms, and the rooms bowed back. At the foot of a hill made from rehearsed amens, he found a door sunk in the ground. It was small enough that pride could not fit through. He walked into the chamber and discovered the archive of arguments that ended early to make room for holding hands. The climate there was spring. A librarian with the face of his better future stamped the word returned into his chest. "You brought back what you borrowed from dawn. Patience," the librarian said. He laughed because the sentence was exactly right and absolutely kind. Leaving the chamber, he found the hill now wore a path that had not been there before. "Others will use it," the librarian called after him, "because your weight sang courage into the ground." Night again, this time with weather. Thunder that had renounced drama, lightning that wrote in cursive across the far ridge, rain that learned your name before falling. He let himself be rained on until his clothes remembered oceans. When the storm cleared, the stars returned with their disciplined glimmer, and the faithful dim star shook itself awake once more. Under that light waited a figure, neither male nor female, old as invitation. The figure held a basin and a towel. Without speaking, it washed his feet. He attempted to protest because he knew the story and his role inside it. But the figure smiled and became his own face, doing for others what had just been done for him. He understood that humility is memory in action. He dried his feet on the towel of committed futures and rose into the service that dissent had always been asking of him. Morning came bearing tools of another kind, questions with edges sanded, answers with doors. The valley guided him to the precinct where language learns manners. There, words rested before being used. He spent an hour with should, teaching it to apologize. Then a morning with love, persuading it to become a verb again. At noon, he sat with enemy and removed its costume. Beneath the garments of rehearsal, he found a frightened kinship. He dressed it in a new coat named Proximity and sent it to eat with neighbor. As they broke bread, fear came close, sniffing at the crust. He gave fear the heel of the loaf, and it lay down, gentle as a Bethlehem beast. In the afternoon, he negotiated a truce between justice and mercy by letting truth officiate their vows. The ceremony required no audience. Vows spoken to wind are the ones wind can carry. When evening lit its candles, he released the words back into the world. They went quietly, eager to labor without being the headline. The valley now slipped into him so completely, he could not tell skin from horizon. In that union, the test of tenderness began. A figure approached whose face rearranged itself into everyone he had ever avoided. First it wore the neighbor who talked too loudly, then the stranger who smelled of every station he had not waited in, then the tyrant whom he could not love without lying. The figure asked for water. He gave it. It asked for dignity. He offered the seat of his invisibility. It asked for truth. He opened the window. When the figure finally wore the face of the one who had hurt him most, he did not embrace out of sentimentality. He stepped aside to make a passage safe enough for both. The figure bowed and became wind. The wind circled him once in gratitude and went hunting for other locked doors. He climbed a low rise and saw the valley filling with lanterns. He did not light them. People arriving from directions prayer had mapped lit them with their own absolutions. Each flame was small enough to be trusted. From above, the valley probably looked like constellations deciding to live on the ground. He lay back and let his spine believe the earth again. In that posture, the old fear returned, not as adversary, but as archivist. It showed him a ledger. Debts he still owed to the hours, to the body, to those who had waited for him to speak first. He signed the ledger with the pen of intention and paid the first installment immediately by sleeping well. Sleep repaid interest nobody else would have honored. Toward midnight, he woke to music played on instruments he could not see. It was the sound of muscles remembering childhood, of doors learning to be thresholds instead of walls, of calendars asking for Sabbath without blushing. He followed the sound to a clearing where a table waited, long enough for a town. The table wore bread, rain, olives, questions, laughter, and room. Around it sat people whose job descriptions had been mislaid. They were not sinners or saints, only guests. An empty chair stood at the end. He took it. The host was the space between them. A toast rose, not by voice but by common consent. To the wind that keeps choosing bodies. They drank from cups that tasted like other people's victories. No one grew drunk, only brave. After the meal, the table asked to become a bridge. They lifted it together and set it over a ditch that had called itself history. The bridge fit perfectly because history had been mismeasured by pride. With the new span, people crossed in both directions, carrying the same light and not claiming it. He guarded the bridge until dawn made its first promise of return. When day stood up, he continued downward and found the kiln where clay learned to withstand love. Potters with palms stained the color of praise-shaped vessels that looked like futures. He placed his hands into the clay and felt it answer with a softness that had strength inside it. The master potter nodded. "Remember, clay remembers the fingerprints of who held it. Leave only blessing." He traced a blessing into one vessel and saw it glow where water would later try to forget its nature. He left the kiln smelling like beginnings. Nearby, a smithy sang with iron that consented to be tool instead of weapon. He learned the difference by striking the anvil until his wrist learned forgiveness. That sound traveled without passport across borders made of fear and told hammers everywhere to befriend hinges. The hinges replied with an operetta of opening. By late afternoon, the valley cooled into a blue that felt like honesty. On a ridge stood the ruins of a gate that had once kept everything worthwhile outside. Now the gate kept nothing at all. He sat in its broken threshold and watched caravans of the unremarkable pass. Nurses counting pulses with their thumbs, gardeners speaking fluent bee, coders leaving a line for wonder, teachers who still believed silence could be taught. He saluted each caravan with the salute of the ordinary. He stood up. The valley answered with a breeze that tasted like what the first sentence tastes like when it realizes it has become a story. The prophet smiled and let the smile remain, unperformed, as shelter for whoever needed it. At sundown, he reached the cavern of vows. Stalactites wore the slow jewelry of centuries. In that cool choir loft, he heard the quiet contracts lovers make with time and keep by accident. To return the grocery cart, to call when the shadow is long, to forgive the same flaw 70 times and then one more. He added his vow to the stalagmites without rehearsing, to be a door with a doorknob even for himself. The cavern accepted and gave him a small stone the size of an amen. He put it under his tongue where prayer and language meet. It dissolved into courage with the flavor of rain on dust. When he emerged, the valley had thinned into a listening so pure, his footsteps arrived before he did. The ground had become a drumhead tuned to the key of welcome. At the far edge, dusk waiting like a patient messenger, he saw the outline of the next chamber, lower, truer, kinder, the place where the valley keeps its oldest question for those who have learned not to argue. He felt in his chest the preface to that question, a pressure that was not pain, a weight that was not burden, a summons the size of a whisper. He inhaled as if borrowing the first breath ever taken, and began the last stretch of this portion of his descent, ready to be asked not what he believed, but what he could make gentle. And as he walked, the wind braided itself through his ribs until he sounded like a small organ in a chapel built by patience. And the valley, satisfied that he had learned to be music, opened its gate to the deeper room where even light must remove its shoes. He stepped through the gate to the deeper room where even light must remove its shoes, and at once the brilliance softened into a reverent dusk, a hush so complete it felt like velvet laid over the nerves. Here the air did not move by inches, but by meanings, and each meaning waited for consent. He understood that this chamber did not welcome achievements, only availability. So he placed his eagerness beside the door like a cloak and entered with nothing but breath. The floor was polished by centuries of kneeling, though he could not see a single footprint. Humility leaves no residue, and the walls were not walls, but patient horizons curved so close that they offered themselves as shelter. In the center, a basin held water that remembered rain before rain had a sky. He approached and saw not his reflection, but versions of himself that had never practiced wonder. The hurried self, the praised self, the defended self, the strategic self. Each face looked useful and therefore tired. He lifted a handful of the water and rinsed his eyes until usefulness blinked and backed away like an animal released into its proper wilderness. When he looked again, the basin no longer showed faces, but a single word written in light. Welcome. He bowed because nothing truer could be said. From the ceiling hung lamps that burned without consuming oil, their flames not flames but agreements, each wick a vow kept in silence. Beneath them lay a table set for one and for multitudes, the paradox that love arranges when it refuses scarcity. On the table, a loaf whose crust carried the map of a desert, and a cup ringed by a horizon of fingerprints. He did not touch them. He waited. Waiting changed the temperature of his body into willingness. Then, like a page turning itself, the room disclosed a second chamber within the first, not by opening a door, but by growing a heart. Inside that heart stood a tree whose leaves were pages and whose fruit were hours. When a breeze rose, the leaves sang softly in a language older than birdsong. He recognized phrases he had heard as a child, when time still trusted him to waste it beautifully. He reached toward a branch, and the tree lowered it as a mother lowers her voice to teach a blessing. "Take and read," said the trembling of the leaf. He read without letters. "You are not here to impress me. You are here to be present with me." He nodded, and the tree nodded in leaf light. A path of embers appeared, cool enough to walk barefoot, warm enough to educate. As he followed it downward, the glow arranged itself into constellations at his feet, star chalk reminding him that guidance is a matter of posture before it is a matter of map. The path led to an archway braided from 3 strands: the courage to see, the patience to stay, the tenderness to serve. And he understood that if any strand snapped, the arch would become a weapon. He put his hand through the braided light and promised aloud to repair whatever snapped within him before it scarred into another's skin. The promise steadied the room. The arch consented. He passed beneath. Beyond the arch, a windless court spread in a gentle ellipse, encircled by benches carved from the same stone as quiet. On each bench sat a story wearing a body. a widow with wrists like empty cradles, a refugee whose accent the border could not translate, a surgeon who had learned to ask forgiveness of hands, a farmer who knew the liturgy of weather, a coder who left a gap in the algorithm named mercy. None spoke. Their breathing braided into a rope strong enough to pull the future 1 inch closer to kindness. He took his seat among them and lent his breath to the rope. As they breathed together, a fourth strand joined the arch behind him, the clarity to release, and he felt something unclench, the need to be necessary. Usefulness has its place, but love refuses to be hired. In that refusal, he felt lighter than leadership and heavier than applause. The court brightened by the width of one gratitude. At the ellipse's focus stood a lectern grown from the root system of the tree he had seen, and upon it lay a book bound in dusk. The cover had no title, only a thumbprint pressed into leather at the place where a pulse would be. He opened to the center and found not chapters but rooms, not paragraphs but windows. In one window, he watched his own future walking toward him slowly, setting bowls of water beside thresholds he had not yet discovered. In another, he saw a city at midnight turn off 1,000 lights it did not need, and the stars stepped closer, relieved to be invited. In a third window, 2 enemies shared a blanket because the night was not partisan. He wished to underline the whole book, but the margins were already crowded with marginalia signed by a hand he could not see. Remember, remember, remember. He traced the word with his finger until it warmed like bread. The book closed itself without offense, and the room listened for his consent. He gave it, not with speech, but with schedule, that hardest of sacrifices. "I will make time," he said, and time, overhearing, forgave him for years of hurry. Then the court shifted into the theater of questions. The questions entered on tiptoe as if not to startle him. What will you do when you are not admired? When your tenderness is mistaken for weakness? When truth arrives without its costume and asks to sleep on your floor? When justice refuses to hate with you? When rest is the holiest work available? He did not answer quickly. Quickness rusts the hinge. He let the questions sit in his lap until their heat taught him how to hold them. Finally, he said, "I will remain." The theater applauded with silence, the only applause that trains the heart. A bell without metal rang, summoning him to the gallery of fractures. There, broken things waited not for repair, but for respect. A cup mended with gold that did not hide its seam. A window cracked into the shape of a map. A promise relearned syllable by syllable. He put his ear to the seam of the gold-mended cup and heard oceans practicing humility as they became rain. He stood before the cracked window and noticed that the map outlined a route from pride to participation. He repeated the route until his feet remembered it without instruction. Then he held the relearned promise in his mouth, the way a child holds a pebble to feel its round truth. When he spoke it, the consonants walked without limping. The deeper room now revealed its hardest kindness, a mirror that refused to reflect anything he pretended to be. He stood before it naked of narrative, only breath and bone and a bruise where certainty had been. The mirror did not judge, it invited. "Come closer," said its quiet. He did, until his breath fogged the glass and drew a heart the way winter windows teach children to confess love. He laughed softly for the first time since entering the chamber. The laugh turned the mirror into a door. The door opened outward into a courtyard where dawn rehearsed itself across a floor of dew. In the center, a stool, and beside it, a basin and towel again. This time not for his feet, but for his words. He washed them, syllable by syllable, until the residue of performance ran clear. When he spoke afterward, the courtyard answered him with birds. From the courtyard, a stair descended, each step labeled with a beatitude that had learned to work overtime. Blessed are the unhurried, the interrupters of shame, the keepers of small vows, the translators of silence, the guardians of unspectacular hope, the repairers of daily bread. He stepped on them as one steps on promises kept by ancestors. At the bottom, he arrived at the vault, where the valley kept its music. Shelves held instruments named by verbs. Welcome, listen, unclench, return, offer, release. He took up the smallest, the instrument called Stay, and strummed it until the vault smelled like kitchens at 6 p.m. A score lay open on the stand, notes written as footprints leading away from self-importance. He followed them out into a cloister of shade where children were instructing angels in how to play. The angels watched carefully as the children demonstrated the sacrament of making room on a bench. The prophet bowed to his teachers. The room of lightless light, the heart of the deeper valley, awaited him now. He entered with his shoes in one hand and his certainty in the other and set both down. Inside, there was no object, only relationship. Every point touching every other point with the courtesy of kin. Here, prayer did not travel, it emerged. He knelt because bodies remember truths, minds forget. From beneath the floor rose the oldest voice the world knows, the one that sounds like your name being pronounced by love. It asked no question. It gave no order. It rested upon him like a shawl woven from all the hands that had ever blessed him, including those he had not recognized at the time. The shawl had a pocket. Inside it lay a stone cut without hands. It was small enough to carry and heavy enough to alter history if thrown. He did not throw it. He placed it over his heart so that its weight could tutor his impulses. The voice approved by growing quieter. The quieter it grew, the larger he became. Not larger than others, larger than his fear of being small. The deeper room dimmed toward night. In the dimness, shapes approached. The debts, the doubts, the distances. He offered them chairs. Hospitality disarmed them. They became advisors with no agenda. The debt taught him to love limits. The doubt taught him to ask kinder questions. The distance taught him to wave until waving became a bridge. When the lamps rekindled, the chairs were empty and a note lay on the table. Thank you for not turning us into enemies. As he rose, a door he had not seen began to breathe. It exhaled a road that led upward not to escape but to engagement. The road was paved with pauses and lined with trees that dropped fruit only when someone sang. He sang, badly but honestly, and the branches obliged. As he ate, sweetness rehearsed itself in his bloodstream until memory tasted like hospitality. From the edge of the road, the valley showed him the world he would re-enter, not as conqueror, not as curator of lessons, but as apprentice to the ordinary. Kitchens, clinics, crosswalks, servers humming their cold lullaby beside a sticky note that read, "Leave room for wonder." Classrooms where silence would be portioned like bread and handed to children who had never met their own thoughts. Courtrooms where verdicts would end in invitations to repair. Boardrooms where profit would learn to blush. He knew he could not build these alone. The deeper room smiled at his realism. No one builds the future. We hold the hinges while it opens. He laughed again, louder, because laughter is the bell that calls courage to the table. Then he shouldered the simplest instrument, the one named Stay, tucked the small stone back into the shawl pocket over his heart. washed his words one last time, put his shoes on with gratitude for leather, and turned toward the breathing door. As he crossed its threshold, the valley tightened the knot that tied him to itself, a gentle tether of purpose. "You may range far," said the tether, "but you will not be lost." He stepped into the gradient between worlds, where errands become sacraments and schedules learn to kneel, and began the ascent that is only another form of descent, because to rise into service is to go lower into love. Above him, a faithful dim star held steady. Within him, the oldest voice kept pronouncing his name as invitation. Ahead of him, the road curved toward people who did not know they were prophets yet. Behind him, the gate of the deeper room closed without locking, the way mercy closes, and the wind, remembering him now as an instrument tuned to tenderness, rehearsed the note it would need when the next valley called. He walked into morning as if it were an unanswered letter, and began composing his reply with footsteps. The road a soft grammar that forgave his earlier punctuation. The shawl of blessings rested across his shoulders. The small, unthrown stone over his heart lent him a measured gravity, and the little instrument named Stay hummed against his palm like a kept promise. At the first village, he passed a bakery breathing out its daily psalm of yeast and heat, and he entered not as a stranger, but as a listener, buying nothing at first, simply letting the aroma catechize his hunger into gratitude. When at last he asked for bread, he paid with coin and attention, and the baker, hands floured with dawn, looked up as if someone had remembered her name in a crowded station. He tore off a piece, blessed it with silence, and left the rest on the sill where schoolchildren would discover that generosity tastes like breakfast. Further on, a clinic waited, its windows tired with watching. Inside, a nurse counted heartbeats with the humility of rain. A doctor kept vigil over a grief that spoke in numbers. The prophet did not announce himself. He washed his words at the sink and offered them back as warm water for tired wrists, as a chair pushed gently toward a mother who had forgotten how to sit. When the monitor complained in flat lines, he laid his palm not on the machine, but on the space between bodies where fear rehearses endings, and there he played the instrument called Stay, just a single chord, patient as winter wheat, and the room learned to breathe together long enough for honest decisions to arrive. No one called it miracle. Everyone called it time. In a school, the chalk had become light, projected from small machines, and silence had been outsourced to rules. He asked for 5 minutes and spent the first 4 teaching the desks to be shores upon which thought could land without drowning. In the last minute, he did nothing at all and invited the children to inventory the music in their lungs. A boy who had not spoken for the length of a semester lifted his head like a horizon and nodded toward an idea that had finally found a chair. The teacher wrote it down, and in that ink, the future decided not to abandon the classroom. Across town, a boardroom sharpened its knives on a quarterly clock. He entered without badge and with the authority of unembarrassed mercy. When the chart that glittered with profit eclipsed the small sun of people, he set the unthrown stone upon the table, its weight read like scripture, and asked 3 questions with the softness of rain on steel. Whom will this success make lonely? What new thing will this courage allow to live? Where is the hinge that opens instead of the hammer that closes? Silence performed what arguments cannot, and one executive, who had inherited a drought in his chest, remembered that his daughter had once asked why his work didn't sing. They adjusted a line item so that the river the project crossed would not forget how to name frogs, and no one died of kindness. In a server room, Winter practiced eternity, Cold air stitched itself through racks of humming engines that kept a million fears distracted. A sticky note on one chassis said, "Leave room for wonder," and he smiled at the anonymous saint who had left it. He added a second note, "Teach your code to breathe between decisions," and tucked a third in his sleeve for later. A reminder that praise is the most portable energy known. Down the block, a courthouse inhaled grievances and exhaled outcomes. Inside, truth limped in on documentary evidence, and compassion waited outside, smoking in the rain. He held the door and invited compassion to testify. When justice rose, it did not roar. It asked the bailiff for a glass of water and offered it to the defendant. A sentence was handed down that began with repair. Across the street, the prophet found a bench warmed by strangers. He sat and became furniture for a while, a place where a city could set its weariness. And pigeons, those gray monks of pavement, ordained him with crumbs. Afternoon arrived with an assignment disguised as a broken crossing signal. Cars barked their urgency. Pedestrians rehearsed their helpless ballet. He stepped into the intersection and lifted one hand, not in command, but in blessing. And because blessing interrupts spectacle, the world remembered its choreography. Drivers discovered they could wait and still be themselves. A woman carrying groceries realized her eggs and hopes could arrive uncracked. A cyclist practiced the liturgy of yielding. He fixed nothing. He only tuned the room to a key where fixing could begin. Near evening, he found the burned shell of a home, black ribs against a lavender sky. Neighbors left flowers and theories. The family returned with hands empty of everything except each other. He took the broom he had borrowed from the valley's avenue of instruments and swept a threshold where ash had declared itself sovereign. The sweep became a small theology. There will be a door again. The father, who had never asked for help because pride had mistaken itself for dignity, took the broom and continued. The mother, who had saved a single photograph that smelled like rain and birthday candles, held it to the light as if briefing the future. Children gathered nails as if they were coins. By moonrise there stood not walls, but willingness. And willingness is the scaffold breath chooses. He moved on, lighted by the work he would not own. He crossed a bridge that remembered wars and decided to retire from them. Beneath, water performed its ancient obedience. On the far bank, a festival of opinions argued itself hoarse about hope. He did not join the debate. He opened a small stall labeled "Listening" and sat without a sign-up sheet. One by one, people came to lay down their heavy nouns. Betrayal, diagnosis, foreclosure, election, silence. He did not solve them. He held them until their edges learned to be less sharp. Sometimes he asked the hinge question the valley had braided for him. What would tenderness do here? And the answer, arriving without applause, adjusted a life by a degree that would later look like destiny. In a chapel without walls, he placed the instrument called stay into the hands of a custodian who had learned more psalms from mops than from psalters. Play this when the lights lie or the budget forgets how to be generous, he said. The custodian strummed a chord, and the sanctuary learned the smell of courage. In a prison, he did not preach. He traded stories like bread and refused the rumor that people are the worst thing they have done. A man with knuckles tattooed into a false prophecy asked if forgiveness had a recipe. He said yes, and it begins with breathing longer than your anger. The man practiced until breath outlasted his story. In a hospice, he sat at a bedside where a woman was graduating into a larger quiet. Family hovered with the clumsy love fear invents. He taught the room to make space by removing urgency and adding presence. The woman's last sentence dressed itself in gratitude and stepped into light. The family learned that sorrow can be strong without shouting. At last, the city exhaled him into night, and he walked until the lamps forgot to pretend they were stars. Actual stars reached down their cold, clean hands and touched his hair with frost. The faithful dim star held still like a vow, and under its tutoring he took inventory. The stone had not grown lighter, only more honest. The shawl had begun to smell like the houses he had entered. The instrument had learned new chords from kitchens and crosswalks. He lay on a bench and let his spine believe the earth again. Sleep came carrying a ledger it did not intend to collect. Inside the sleep, a dream. The valley visited the city, and the city did not defend itself. Streets opened like psalms. Elevators confessed their fear of heights. Algorithms took Sabbath. Hammers sang in minor keys to honor timbers that had a history. He woke with laughter that did not need witnesses, a bell that called morning to its work. The next day, he walked into a marketplace where beauty was measured in applause and chose instead to buy a single quiet object, a clay cup whose glaze held the memory of the potter's thumb. He drank water from it in front of the crowd, as if performing a miracle, and indeed he was. Hydration without spectacle. A child watched with the concentration that only those still fluent in wonder can bear. He handed the cup to the child and said, "Take this and give it to someone who looks thirsty in their eyes." The child understood instantly and ran off with a priestly seriousness that outlived Saturday. Later, in a garden shaved into obedience by landscaping, he let weeds make their legal case. The verdict surprised no one honest. Some wildness is the steward of bees and therefore of breakfast. He left 3 corners untrimmed and called the act a hymn. Evening flamed and cooled, and somewhere a siren learned to soften. He followed it to an apartment where 2 brothers argued over an inheritance of dust. Inside their speech, he placed the stone, not as threat, but as fulcrum, and asked them to balance their father's last kindness upon it. The argument tipped into tears and then into the architecture of repair. No lawyer lost his job, only his appetite for turning love into a contest. He walked back into streetlights singing poorly on purpose to let others be brave enough to hum. In an alley, a woman fed cats names because names persuade loneliness to sit. He sat with her and learned 3 ways to bless a creature that does not intend to thank you. Midnight witnessed the sacrament of small continuances. At the edge of the district, where glass towers study their reflections, he built a tiny altar from pocket things: pebble, thread, page corner, crumb, and upon it he placed the day. The altar did not smoke, it breathed. He prayed as one prays when prayer is the last honest name for attention. Thank you for not wasting my ordinary. The faithful dim star agreed by refusing to blink. He turned and saw, walking toward him from the dark that is not enemy, a figure that looked like tomorrow. Tomorrow wore work boots and carried seedlings and a list of names he did not recognize. "I will need help planting these," Tomorrow said without lips. He nodded and reached for the shovel he did not have, and discovered that consent is a tool that fits every hand. Together, they seeded the median of a road with a species of patience that blooms in traffic. Within an hour, drivers rolled down windows and smiled at strangers because pollen had entered the vents. Toward dawn, he returned to the bench where his body stored the day's light. The city drowsed like a child who fought sleep nobly. He placed the instrument named Stay across his chest, and played one chord for those who were working while others rested, and one for those who were resting because others worked. A breeze from the river rehearsed its oldest love song against the bridge's ribs. His own ribs answered in harmony. He slept in the confidence of those who have nothing to prove, and the valley visited him again, not to retrieve him, but to anoint the road. "You are not finished," said the wind that speaks in verbs, "but you are faithful." The sentence tasted like bread. When he woke, the horizon had placed a small ember in the east, and the ember began to teach the sky how to glow. He stood, rolled his shoulders beneath the shawl, felt the stone's instructive weight, tuned the instrument by listening to pigeons, and stepped into another day that had not yet learned its courage. As he walked, the tether to the valley tugged once, not to summon but to synchronize, and he realized the descent had become a rhythm, the ascent a responsibility, the city a monastery without cloisters. He would continue until the hinge of history needed oil and his hands could offer it, until a room forgot its key and his presence could remind it how to open, until a child mistook fear for wisdom and his laughter could correct the translation. And far ahead, he sensed a turning, Block 5 waiting like a river bend, where the nameless prophet would be asked not only to serve, but to suffer beautifully, to let love spend him in a currency that cannot be counted, to carry the breath through a winter that would test whether songs remember their notes when mouths are cold. He tightened the shawl, placed the stone, lifted the instrument, and walked toward that bend with the stubborn peace of a man who has learned to be weather rather than news. He reached the bend where wind began to speak in plural, and pain introduced itself without disguise. The road had become narrow, carved through a pass of glass that reflected every kindness he had failed to finish. The shawl that once felt like blessing grew heavy, soaked with the gravity of every name he had carried lightly. Ahead, the air trembled the way an unanswered prayer trembles in the throat of a storm. He walked into it knowing that suffering is not punishment, but permission to love without proof. The first test came as silence, not the silence that comforts, but the kind that cancels music. It stripped him of story until even gratitude stuttered. He called to the voice that had always met him halfway and heard nothing but the echo of his own breath folding back. Despair, that old tutor, arrived polite and thorough. It offered him rest. It offered him cynicism. It offered him the small throne of self-pity. He refused each gift gently because anger wastes the lesson. Instead, he knelt among the ruins of his confidence and whispered the valley's liturgy. Stay, listen, wait. Time passed through him like wind through scaffolding. The stars withheld commentary. Even the dim, faithful one hid behind a cloud to prove devotion isn't dependency. Then the blow arrived in human form, a messenger from the world bearing news. Famine in the region he had blessed. Disease in the village he had healed. War breaking the bridge he had tuned to peace. All that he had built with breath was now undone by weather. The messenger asked if he regretted descending. He answered, "Regret is for those who mistook outcome for meaning." Still, when night came, he wept, without drama, like rain washing a name from stone. Dream returned, cruel and kind. He stood again before the deeper room, but now the lamps were extinguished. In their place, mirrors floated, showing not his face, but the faces of those who suffered because hope takes time to mature. Children with ribs like xylophones, mothers counting disappearances, soldiers whose hands could no longer forget the shape of trigger. Each face asked the same question. Where was the promise? He wanted to tear the sky open, to demand an explanation large enough to cradle grief. But the sky was busy being honest. So he stayed and looked until looking became prayer, and prayer became the ache that teaches vision. Somewhere behind the silence, a whisper began, not in words, but in pulse. Bear it. That is how I bear you. He woke at dawn with salt dried on his cheeks, and a vow renewed not to escape compassion's cost. The second trial came disguised as friendship. A group of travelers found him by the river and asked for guidance. They had maps, he had memory. Together they spoke of roads, of miracles, of methods. They called him wise, saint, teacher. Praise is a solvent that erases edges. He felt himself dissolving into the image they required. One evening they argued about his origin, whether he was divine or deceived, and their need for certainty built an altar of misunderstanding. When he tried to speak, they interrupted. When he listened, they crowned his silence with myth. He realized too late that they loved their version of him more than the truth. To remain free, he had to disappoint them. He said, I am not your miracle. I am your mirror. They left angry because love that doesn't flatter sounds like betrayal. Alone again, he watched their torches recede and wondered if light ever forgives being carried away. By the third moon, his strength broke. Fever entered him as a tutor enters a classroom emptied of students. He lay beneath a sky indifferent to small heroics. The shawl that had warmed him now weighed like obligation. He considered returning to the valley to die where everything began. But even death must be honest. So he waited. In delirium, he saw the old librarian from the archive of arguments sitting at his bedside, stamping each breath with the word returned. You brought back patience, the librarian said. Now learn endurance. Pain refined his prayers into monosyllables. Help, hold, here. The last word echoed longest. Here. The fever broke the way a wave breaks, leaving him soaked but alive. Around him, strangers tended him without knowing his name. Compassion wore ordinary faces. A girl wiping his forehead with the sleeve of her hunger. An old man singing a tune his wife had left unfinished. A thief who refused to steal his water because the sick should keep what refreshes them. Each act rewrote theology in the dialect of mercy. When he rose again, thinner but transparent with gratitude, he found the world rearranged. The famine had not ended, but people shared. The disease still hunted, but laughter misled it. The war paused each night at the border of song. He understood then that redemption does not erase pain. It composts it into soil capable of feeding the next kindness. He walked among the ruins of the bridge he had tuned long ago and discovered a single plank intact, inscribed by rain with the sentence, "Nothing wasted." He knelt and pressed his forehead to it until humility turned into heat. Then, from the horizon, a dust cloud approached, an army. He did not flee. The soldiers halted, expecting resistance. He stood unarmed except for breath and the small stone over his heart. Their captain, young and frightened beneath authority, shouted for surrender. The prophet raised his hands and said, "I already have." The words confused violence. Confusion delayed obedience. Delay allowed doubt to bloom. The captain lowered his weapon first. Others followed. The war ended not with treaty, but with fatigue of hatred. The prophet smiled because fatigue, too, is a teacher. That night, beneath the faithful dim star, he offered his only possession, the stone, to the river. But the river refused. "You have not yet learned the lesson of weight," it said in ripples. "Keep it until you meet one heavier." He obeyed. Sleep brought a final trial, the vision of the one he served walking away. Not in anger, in necessity. The voice said, "You must learn to continue without me visible." He reached out, but grasped only air bright with departure. Loneliness expanded until it became architecture. He built shelter in it. When he woke, dawn rested on him like absolution. He understood that faith is not presence, but persistence. The road rose to meet him, and he stepped onto it barefoot, scarred, luminous, not victorious, but trustworthy. The valley echoed once more from memory, a whisper of approval. "You have descended far enough to rise rightly." He continued walking, carrying the weight that was not his own, and the world, seeing him pass, mistook him for hope in human form. He entered the last country of the road, as a lantern enters a dark house. Not to conquer the rooms, but to reveal what was always there. Fields unrolled like psalms nobody had finished reading. Windows forgot to defend themselves against morning and the horizon. Noticing he had learned how to carry weight without weapon, untied its knot and gave him a farther line to follow. He passed orchards where frost had bruised the blossoms and touched each branch with the two-word blessing the valley had sown into his breath. Begin again. He passed factories where noise had mistaken itself for purpose and opened a window in the wall so that wind could read the room. He passed a woman washing the day from her hands at a pump that sighed like an old hymn and asked if she would lend him her bucket. She did, and he carried water to a man who had forgotten thirst could be trusted. In each small circuit, the world remembered a syllable of its first language. Then the tether in his chest tightened, a summons with the kindness of command. And he knew the valley was asking him to return, not to retreat, but to reconcile beginnings with what they had become. He climbed a hill that held the memory of his earliest fear and did not avert his eyes when the ghosts rehearsed their tired theater. He simply stayed until they lost interest in pretending and asked for work. He gave them errands, set the table, sweep the threshold, warm the towel, and as they labored, their transparency learned to serve. At the ridge, the faithful dim star lowered itself like a seal onto wax, and the night carried the signature of consent. Descending toward the familiar hush, he felt no triumph, only a widening capacity. The gate of the deeper room exhaled, and he removed his shoes without instruction. The lamps greeted him with flames that had learned to whisper. In the basin, he rinsed away the dust of outcomes. The tree of hours rustled and dropped a fruit into his hands. And when he broke it, time ran out like honey. He poured the sweetness into the book bound in dusk, and its windows swung open on hinges oiled by suffering. In one window, the bridge he had loved, now arched across a river restored by patience. In another, a hospital corridor smelled faintly of courage. In a third, a courtroom adjourned early to make room for repair. The book wrote 2 words in his own handwriting, "Keep choosing," and closed like a breath returning to its ribcage. The floor beneath him thrummed with the heartbeat of everything willing to live. And then the valley presented the lesson the river had promised, a weight heavier than the stone. It came as a child carrying an urn of ashes that used to be her brother. She asked if the wind could learn his name. He took the urn and set it in the shawl's pocket above his heart, so that grief would ride where pride once had. The valley did not remove the pain. It rearranged the furniture so love could sit. The old librarian appeared, ink on fingers, and stamped the urn with a word that blazed without burning. Beloved. Something in the architecture of loss yielded, and a room opened that grief had been guarding. A room where memory could loosen its fists. There the child slept for the first time since Flame taught her the alphabet of absence. He kept watch and discovered that vigil is a kind of resurrection that does not need applause. At dawn, the valley lifted a door on its hinges of mercy, and the prophet stepped through into the amphitheater of bones. Now not a stadium of waiting, but a workshop of breath. The rib harp lay where he had left it, and when he drew his fingers across it, the chord returned, informed now by winters survived. The bones did not clatter. They consented. Sinew found its courage. Flesh remembered its script, and faces turned toward the east with that look humans wear when forgiven. He did not shout "Lève." He said "Stay" and life, relieved to be invited without. Spectacle obliged. Among the risen, he recognized the thief who had spared his water, the nurse who had counted pulses like wishes, the captain who had lowered his weapon first. To each he assigned a small vocation: carry kettles, defend a lullaby, teach doors to open, and the valley approved with rain. The rain stitched green into the gray, and the green rehearsed a slow crescendo until hills wore choirs. He lifted the little instrument named Stay and played the chord over the whole country. Lakes found their manners, tools found their hinges, calendars found their Sabbath. Then the one he loved arrived without arrival, the way light happens, the way forgiveness happens, and stood where language must bow. No voice sounded, because conversation would have been too small. Instead, a weather passed through him, bright and gentle, and he understood it as commissioning. "You are not sent to win," the weather said. "You are sent to remain. You are not sent to explain. You are sent to embody. You are not sent to end the night. You are sent to keep a lamp where night forgets itself." He bowed until his forehead met the floor, and the floor learned his name. When he rose, the child with the urn was awake, holding not ashes, but a handful of wildflower seeds the rain had persuaded from the lip. Together they planted them along the path out of the valley, and he realized that every return must sign its passage with something that feeds the bees. At the gate, he took the stone from the shawl, and for the first time it felt light enough to throw, not as judgment, but as genesis. He cast it not at the statue of pride, but into the garden of a neighborhood that needed a cornerstone. Where it landed, foundations remembered their craft. Houses that would shelter unremarkable holiness began, one afternoon at a time. He looked back only once, never to worship the valley, always to give thanks. And the valley answered with a wind that braided itself through his ribs and tuned him to the key of usefulness. He went out then, into years that had been waiting for a body steady enough to carry simple instructions. Find the kitchens where grief cooks for children and wash the bowls. Find the offices where power forgets to blush and lend them a mirror. Find the borders where names are confiscated and write them back on foreheads with the ink of welcome. Keep breathing when arguments get lonely. Keep laughing when maps pretend not to know rivers. Keep resting so that prayers can find your lap. And when you are finally asked what you did with the descent, say, "I learned to stay until staying opened. I learned to love until love spent me. I learned to hope without headlines." The world believed him because he never asked it to. He carried the shawl until it wore thin where shoulders become doors, and when it finally tore, he stitched it with threads from the apron of a baker, the sleeve of a nurse, the hem of a child's dress. It looked like patchwork, and therefore like truth. Sometimes he felt again the silence of God and did not panic. Silence is the room where voices rest so they can sing. Sometimes losses returned and sat at his table without knocking. He poured them tea and they left with fewer knives. Sometimes praise wanted a stage. He handed it a broom. The faithful dim star aged without fading, a punctuation mark at the end of every hour reminding him that sentences continue. And when at last his body grew old enough to negotiate with gravity, he chose a bench that remembered useful conversations and set down the instrument named Stay upon his knees. People came the way rivers come, by accident and appointment, and he tuned their stories until the water cleared. At twilight, the child, now grown and luminous in ordinary ways, brought him a cup from the first bakery he had blessed, and a handful of seeds from the path where they had planted after rain. He smiled and asked her to scatter them when breath chose its next house. She promised with the seriousness that outlives Saturday. Night gathered, not as enemy, but as blanket. He leaned back, letting the sky teach his spine its last lesson. The one he loved did not arrive because presence had learned to be everywhere. He exhaled into the city the way rivers exhale into seas, and the air caught the note and kept it. This was not an ending, only a hinge. The valley, hearing the chord from far away, opened its gate for whoever next would descend. And the world, practicing resurrection in unphotographed corners, continued, steady as bread rising on an honest counter. If this story breathed through you, keep the lamp where night forgets itself. Keep the bench warm. Keep the water near. And when you must choose, choose the hinge over the hammer, the seed over the slogan, the stay over the spectacle. Take one more deliberate breath, as if gathering a scattered people, and release it as blessing over the nearest street. Because prophecy is simply love that learned to persist.